Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone. Now we will talk about two topics on externalities and public good. This is basically for the students with an economics background to give them a brief revision of these concepts and to introduce the students who may not have the background in economics and are doing this particular course. So externalities, when we talk about, before we talk about externalities, let us look at what do you mean by a market. In economics, we talk about a market as a place where the transactions happen between the buyers and the sellers. When buyers and sellers come together, essentially bringing together the forces of demand and supply, also leads to determination of the market price. However, there are possibilities and situations whereby you will find that an action which is now taken by a producer or by a consumer, it may not reflect in the market prices, though it will be influencing the other consumer or a producer. So I'll just simplify this for you with an example. So what we are talking about is basically an action. This action can be taken either by a producer or a consumer. Second, it influences other producer or a consumer. And what is the main feature? The feature is that such interaction or impact is not accounted for in the market price. So let us understand these three things using an example. Say for instance, there is a tannery. Now this tannery is located on the side of a river and it throws all its effluent in the river. Downstream that river, suppose it is throwing its effluent in the river, and downstream there are some fishermen who now depend upon their catch on a daily basis from that river to make their living. Because of the effluent which comes from the tannery now, the catch is affected, the fish are dying because of the chemicals engaged in that. As a result, what is happening? There is a producer who has taken a certain action, and that action is now affecting the other producer who are now a fisherman, and then they are getting a catch from the river and selling them in the market. And this kind of an action is now no longer being able to capture through the market price. So effectively what is happening, the producer in that tannery is using the natural resource, which is in terms of availability of the water, and throwing their effluent and affecting the livelihood of the fishermen who are now located downstream. So this kind of a situation is what we call as externality. And here what we have seen is an example of a negative externality. Why we are calling it a negative externality? Because it influences the other producer in a negative manner. On the other hand, there could be a situation of a positive externality. So once again, before I go into the what is an example of a positive externality, let us just revisit the definition. Essentially, an action taken by a producer and consumer affecting the other producer or a consumer but not accounted for in the market price. We have seen a case of a negative, and let us see an example of a positive externality. Suppose outside of your house you put up a huge maybe a bulb with a high voltage, which is able to now light up the quite a lot of area around it. And what you find that in the evening, maybe somebody who does not have an access to electricity are sitting there, and then they are able to read in that particular light. When you put up that electric bulb there, you were not thinking of this kind of an impact on somebody else, but it has a positive impact. The other case can be where suppose somebody undertakes a major repair outside their house, and as a result the neighborhood lights up, it becomes bright, it becomes beautiful. However, while doing that kind of a repair, or maybe introducing a garden in your in front of your house, you were not thinking of the positive impact it may have on all the neighbors around. So once again, a situations of a positive externality. So as I said, there can be two externality, can be positive or negative, and I have given you the examples for the same. Now what happens? How does this externality influences the market transaction? You have seen it very clearly here that when the effluent was coming from the tannery, the fishermen are now getting negatively impacted. But there is no way for them to go back to the tannery owner and then argue with them, because that person can always say that we are throwing it in the river and it is not our problem. So what is the impact of this kind of negative externality and a positive externality, and how interventions are required in order to deal with it, is what we are going to learn today. So one case of in case of a negative externality, we have seen that there is a cost, right? There is a cost of production. This cost of production now belongs to the producer, right? The tannery owner, and it has certain cost engaged in it, including total cost, which is a combination of your fixed and a variable cost, etc. But there is also a certain cost now which is imposed on the society, right? And this is what we will call as a marginal external cost. So that will be talked about in terms of the external cost. So what is external cost? Essentially, a cost which is imposed externally, not on the firm itself, but to an outsider by the firm when it increases its output. We will also put a word in front of it, marginal. In case of a marginal, we in economics we use this term very frequently, and essentially it in this context we'll talk about increase in the cost of the, let us say of this particular production, because of one more unit increase in the output as such. So now the producer, if it increases its output by one more unit, then what is the increase in the external cost which is imposed? Please note that there is also going to be an impact on the private cost. That is again is the marginal cost of production, which we are already well aware of, right? So which might include your variable factors of production and the cost imposed because of the use of that kind of a factor of production. Here we are talking about the marginal external cost, whereby if the output of the tannery producer increased by one more unit, then how much of an external cost is imposed because of that. So then what we have is a marginal cost of production, which is the cost of production for the producer, and then we have the marginal external cost, which is now imposed to the party which is external to the production for the particular producer. Now when we put them together, that is the sum of the marginal cost of production, that is for the producer, and marginal external cost will give us what we call as a marginal social cost. But I hope the intuition behind this is very clear. So you have a cost of production which is now internal to the firm, and they will definitely take into consideration the cost while making a decision with respect to the output that to be produced that will maximize their profit. However, they will not take into consideration the external cost which is now being imposed. From the point of view of a society and a social planner, we have to bring these two together and understand what is the marginal social cost and its impact on the market. So now, in order to understand the impact on the market, let us look at a very simple case of a situation whereby a perfect competition situation where the firm is taking the price as a given, right? And it has its own marginal cost. As per the profit maximizing decision making, the firm will be deciding to produce where their price is equal to the marginal cost. So what is the price? Price will add to the benefit of a producer when they will sell one more unit of the output, and marginal cost is the cost imposed on a firm when they increase the output by one more unit. So intuitively also it makes sense that the firm will be deciding the output to be produced whereby price is equal to your marginal cost. Based on that, what you will see that the firm individual will be deciding to produce at a, let us say, Q naught. Now what we have said that in case of an externality there is going to be an external cost imposed, and once again if you are looking at a tannery, the external cost which is now going to be imposed, it increases with the output. So on the x-axis we have output, and on the y-axis we have the price and the marginal cost. Right. So now as the output increases, what we will find is that output keeps on, as the output increases, your marginal external cost also increases. Now when we put together this marginal external cost with the marginal cost of the firm, what we will get? We will get the marginal social cost, which is now being shown through this dotted line. Now if you look at this marginal social cost and then equate it to the price, you will find that the profit maximizing output should be Q1 and not Q naught. So what is happening in the market? In this case of a situation when you have a presence of a negative externality, the marginal social cost is higher than the marginal cost of production, which is a private cost of production for that particular individual firm. Why it is higher? Because it is imposing an external cost on the society. When you put them together, what you find, the market is essentially or the firm is essentially now over producing. That means the output which is being determined by the firm is profit maximizing for them is actually over and above the output which should be produced as per the, when we take into consideration the cost imposed on the society. So what you have is an overproduction. The output which is produced is much higher than the output which would be socially optimal when you take into consideration the external cost being imposed as such. So then clearly we have a situation, and since the market is not being now working efficiently, what you may need is a situation of a intervention from the government as such, but we will talk about it later. Now this we have done as a case from an individual firm point of view. You can extend it to the industry as such. In the industry, what will happen now is with the assumption that all the firms have the same cost structure, what you will find is, suppose this is a demand curve in the particular market of the hides, let us say, and then you are now putting together the supply curve, which is the sum of the marginal cost of all the firms to begin this from the point, and it will be equal to sum of the marginal cost for all the firms which are there in the industry. Based on that, what you will find, once again the price is now being determined at P naught and the output is now being determined at a Q naught. When we are using this capital Q, essentially we are highlighting the industry output. When we take into consideration once again the marginal external cost being imposed by all the tanneries which are now throwing their effluents in the river, and put it together with the marginal private cost, then what we will have is once again a curve which will be marginal social cost. again a supply curve which takes into consideration the external cost imposed by the throwing of the effluent in the river. If you go by that, what you will have is the price should be essentially P1 in the market and output should be essentially Q1 in the market. So what you have seen is in a market situation whereby when you do not take into consideration the marginal external cost being imposed, the price is rather lower, output is more. However, once you introduce these things, and you will find that the price should be higher in the market and output should be lower. Then what we find is that if that is not being done and the producers are not taking into consideration the external cost imposed, then what is happening? The P naught would be the price and Q naught would be the output produced. Now, if you look at the social cost which is being imposed, then if I go up till here, this entire area will be reflecting what? This higher area, this entire area of this particular triangle will be reflecting the social cost which is being imposed by the throwing of the effluent in the river, which is not being now taken care of. So this would be, this entire red area would be the social cost of the negative externality related to the throwing of the effluent which we have talked about. So next what we can talk. So we have taken an example of a negative externality. For our course, what is more important and what is more relevant is the situation of a positive externality. Now think from a point of view of a firm which is now maybe engaged in a basic research and development. Firms may not be engaged in basic, they might be engaged in more applied version of research and development that might have a straightforward impact on the introduction of the new product. So let us say take a case of a pharmaceutical firm which is now thinking of coming up with a drug for a new disease which has not been there as of now. Once they come up with this particular solution or maybe a molecule which can help them in designing that particular drug, and the drug is out there in the market, let us say, other firms will be able to learn from it. They can always reverse engineer it and understand what the particular work has been done by the firm in order to deal with a specific disease and introduce this particular drug. So the firm will be able to maybe mass produce that particular drug and will be able to sell in the market. So clearly they will be able to make the private benefits out of that. There are now mechanisms also available like patents, etc., but we will talk about it later. Let us first think from a situation where suppose nothing of that sort is available and now the firm will not be able to kind of recover the external benefits which it has caused for the other firm. So what is happening here is some kind of a spillover of the information which is happening with respect to the other rivals that are in the pharmaceutical industry. Because of the introduction of this new drug, the other firms can also learn from it. So there is a private benefit which accrue to this particular firm, but apart from that, there is an external benefit that also happens. Say for example, we have seen the case of putting up a bulb which has a high voltage and then it's essentially lighting up a lot of area around your house, and somebody comes and sits and does his or her homework there in the evening. In the same way, we also talked about the repair, maybe putting up a garden outside your house, which is now again brightening up and making the neighborhood look much more better. So in the same way, if we talk about the research and development which might be conducted at a firm level, there might be external benefit and which are different from the private benefit for the individual firm. We can take it little bit much further, and the basic research which will be conducted maybe in academic institutions, universities, etc., and maybe the government sponsored or publicly funded research laboratories will have a lot more in that sense external benefit. So what we are now talking about in the last section, when we talk about the negative externality, we talked about the marginal external cost. Now we will talk about marginal external benefit. So let me put it here, marginal external benefit. What is that? This is essentially an increase in the benefit which happens or accrues to the other firm, okay, or the other parties as this particular firm increases its output by 1 unit. So increased benefit that accrues to other party. Okay. When in another firm increases its output by 1 unit. Then, like we did earlier, so we will put together this external benefit with the marginal private benefit. So there will be a marginal private benefit which would be increased in the benefit of that individual firm itself when they will increase its output by 1 unit, right? So there will be marginal private benefit plus the marginal external benefit. Once we put them together, what we will have is a marginal social benefit. Okay. Sum of marginal private benefit and the marginal external benefit will give us the marginal social benefit. Now, let us first look at the problem intuitively and understand where the issue will come into. Now, when a firm is taking into consideration the benefit that will accrue to itself, that is the marginal private benefit, the decision making is now going to be different from when a social planner will in fact think about the external benefit that will accrue. Like in the last case, we have seen what was happening because of the social cost being higher than the marginal private cost. The output which is now optimal, which should be produced in the society, is rather lower as compared to what is being produced. So in a similar way, you will find that the differences will emerge in case of a positive externality also. So now if we talk about, once again, is a suppose a case of an individual firm, right? So it has certain benefits which will enjoy. Or let us seek one example in which a firm has now to make a decision of how much financial capital to invest in the R&D project. Okay. So in order to decide that, that is the financial capital to be invested. Okay. On what basis the firm will decide? Clearly, they will have to see the net present value of the profit which will accrue to them over a period of a time, and the rate of interest will become an important decision variable. So now, based on that, let us say they have to make a decision of the quantity of financial capital on the left, on the x-axis, and on the y we have the rate of return. Now, as this will be going down, what you will have is a curve like this. So what is this curve telling us? This is this particular curve will give us the demand for the capital for the firm itself with respect to the rate of interest. As the rate of interest will go down, the willingness of the firm to invest in the R&D project is now rather increasing. So suppose that there are different rate of returns which are available. Let me call it maybe 12% and 8 or 6 and 4, and the going rate is, let us say, is somewhere around 7%. Okay. So based on that, the firm will decide that it should invest Q naught amount of financial capital in their research and development projects. What we have talked about is effectively the private benefit and then equating it with the interest rate and finalizing the amount of capital to be invested. But we have already seen that there is going to be a positive externality associated with this kind of an investment and leading to a marginal external benefit, right? So then if once we introduce this external benefit to it, essentially you should have this curve being shifted towards the outward one, and that would be your from the basis of the society's point of view, right? So the willingness of the society, they in fact they think that the amount should be invested into because of the positive externalities associated with that. For the same rate of return, you will find that this amount is now going to be much higher. Now, so just to put it simply, what is happening, because there are positive benefits associated with the investment in the research and development by the firm, the social benefits are higher. The society or the social planner would in fact intend that the amount which is now invested, the financial capital invested into the R&D project should be much higher vis-a-vis the actual amount that might be invested. Now, why is this happening? This is happening because why the amount expected invested is rather lower is because the firms are now not able to kind of account for or kind of were able to appropriate the investment they are making into the research and development completely. There are certain spillovers which are beyond them, and they are not able to make returns from that particular investment completely. So as a result, what will happen? The investment which will be made in the society or by the firm in the research and development is going to be much lower. So moving on, we have understood the problem. We have understood the problem associated with the negative externality as well as with the positive externality. In case of a negative externality, we have seen there is going to be a situation of an overproduction, and in case of a positive, we have seen a case of an underproduction. And this is a case which is more relevant for our course. Now, having understood that there is a market failure associated as and when there is an presence of an externality, what is to be expected? Now, we have seen that in case of a market, we say that's the forces of demand and supply which will come together and determine the market price. The efficient price will be determined. However, considering this kind of a situation, since there is a market failure, we would expect, or we would rather have some kind of interventions devised. Those interventions we have already seen is, for instance, in case of a negative externality, can be associated with maybe having an emission fee, putting up the emission standards, and other such interventions by the government. So we have already seen that there are situations where there are actions which you can say that by the government they will either put up an emission fee or set up the emission standard beyond which firms cannot do that, or they would impose certain other kind of restrictions on the firm in order to ensure that the negative externality is now rather taken care of. So they try to account for it in the market price by increasing the cost from the point of view of the firms as such. But as I said earlier, for us what is important is the case of the positive externality. What we have understood is the knowledge of spillovers, and then what kind of an intervention can be defined. So one intervention which we have seen is that of the subsidization. So here what we see is the subsidizing of research and development. First of all, we have also seen that in case of a basic research, a lot more investment comes through the public fund. That is one way to do it. So the government invests in the basic kind of research and development. In order to incentivize the companies to invest more in research and development, subsidization also happens. They can be given some kind of a tax credits, whereby if they invest in research and development, then the tax credits can be given to them. Apart from that, like we said earlier, is the case of the intellectual property rights. So intellectual property rights, specifically in case of technology driven products, are the important role is being played by the patents. So how the intellectual property rights will help? They will essentially help the firms in earning more and more returns from their R&D. These IPRs will help them in putting a boundary and defining their property rights appropriately with respect to their invention, and as a result, even if the other firms would want to use it, they can use a market mechanism like licensing, etc., in order to appropriate their own intellectual property. So what we will find that in this case, when we are talking about innovation, invention, it is much easier to define the property rights. IPRs can be provided and are being provided by the countries, which helps the firm in designing and defining the property right over their particular invention, and hence help them in appropriating the returns from the investment that they have made in research and development. In this course, we will have a longer discussion on the intellectual property right as an institution which is created to incentivize research and development. However, when we talk about the basic research, then in these cases, it would be rather difficult, as for example, discoveries cannot be patented and so on and so forth, and there you will find that the government subsidies will play a very important role. So what we have understood is that because of the presence of the positive externality with respect to research and development, there are interventions devised by the government in order to support these kind of activities by the firm. Now what we will look at, another important concept in this case, that is of the public good. The public good, again you can see the kind of a good which will have a positive externality, but if you define them, let us first define them and then understand this particular idea. So public good essentially are non-exclusive and non-rival goods. What do we mean by this? Non-rivalry is rather easy to conceptualize. Here the idea is, suppose an individual now consumes a particular product. That will affect the consumption of the other person in the sense that the other person will no longer be able to consume it. Say for example, if you have an apple and you're sitting in your class and then you consume that apple, clearly your friend cannot have it. So the consumption by an individual will influences or reduces the consumption or the ability of the other to use it. So that product becomes rivalrous in consumption. Whereas there are goods which are non-rivalrous in consumption. That means if an individual consumes it, it will not affect the ability of the others to do that. For example, the country will provide for national defense, then all the individuals in a particular country will be able to avail the national defense, right? It's not like that some enemies can come and attack a particular group in that case. Then, so apart from the, but when we talk about the public goods, what we find, they are non-rivalrous in consumption. That means that good for which the, now talking technically here, what will happen, but once you have made a provision for, let us say, something like national defense, the marginal cost of making the provision for that particular product for an additional consumer is going to be zero, right? So then what we are talking about is a non-rivalrous good. Clearly here you see that the knowledge, for example, the class example we were seeing that if you eat an apple, clearly your friend cannot have that. However, if you are hearing the lecture, and the teacher is giving the lecture in that particular class, just because you are understanding it, it doesn't reduces the ability of the other person to understand it. So then this is a very specific context in the classroom. I'm just trying to explain it, but very specific cases of goods which are non-rivals in consumption, like I said earlier, is that of a national defense and clearly knowledge also. Just because one person consumes it, it doesn't reduce the ability of the other to consume it as such. Another characteristics of the public good is that of the non-exclusive. That means it is very difficult or in fact impossible to prevent other people from using it. Now suppose a road has been built or there is a public park. Anyone can walk into the park and if one person, it is very difficult to exclude other people from using it. So non-exclusive and non-rival goods essentially are the two important characteristics which we look at while defining the public good. What is the implication of these two characteristics is basically that the marginal cost of making provision for an additional consumer of that particular product is now going to be zero. At marginal cost of provision to an additional consumer is zero, right? And people cannot be excluded from consuming it. So when you bring together these two concepts, what you have is a public good. But if you look around ourselves, definitely there are certain combinations. For instance, we gave you an example of that. I gave you an example of that public park, right? Now what we find that there might be a ticket imposed on it. A certain amount of excludability is now being imposed. Roads, right? If it is a public road, anybody can walk onto it. But however, now what we have is a toll versus a toll and a non-toll road as such. So if you put excludability on in this particular case, and put rivalrous in consumption, if a product is rivalrous in consumption and also excludable, then definitely what we are talking about is a private good. We have seen an example of that, right? Most items of consumption in that case. Now on the other hand, if they are rivalrous in consumption but it is not possible to exclude, then what we are talking about is the common resources. If for instance there is a pond, right? So fish in a pond, it might be rivalrous in consumption for all the fishermen, but it is not possible to exclude everybody from going and fishing. If they are in this particular vicinity, they would want to go and catch the fish. On the other hand, if the good is not rivalrous in consumption, but there is a possibility to exclude, then what you have is a case of the club good. The last one is where it is not possible to, which is non-rival and non-excludable, then clearly you have a case of a public good, right? Like we gave an example of a national defense, and to a larger extent that of a basic research also. Now what is once again important for us to understand is that this public good, the way we are talking about, is they have a positive externality. However, please note all the goods which have a positive or a negative externality will not be public good. And once again here what will happen, the idea here is that that of a free riders problem, whereby what will the outcome of a particular nature or the characteristics of the good would be that the consumer or the producer essentially will not pay for the non-exclusive good within the expectation that the others will do that, right? So maybe expecting that somebody else will do this kind of a research and we will be able to benefit from that kind of a case. So in another cases we see that public good, essentially what will happen, the marginal cost of the provision to an additional consumer is now going to be zero. So clearly the motivation which the companies will have in order to invest in the research and development is going to be rather limited. Given these specific characteristics and the market failure associated with the externality and the public good, what we will find? We will find that there is a need for an intervention from the government perspective in order to incentivize, in order to ensure that the research and development investments actually happen by the firms. So we'll close this particular section here, and thank you so much.